Howdy, this is Karen from Karen Dawn Designs, and today I'm going to talk to you about how to swatch in the round. The first thing that you need to do when you decide to swatch is figure out how many stitches to cast on for your gauge swatch. If you notice the gauge on this example pattern, you'll see that there are 20 stitches over 4 inches in stockinette. You might be tempted to just cast on 20 stitches and knit your gauge swatch that way, but don't do that. No matter what method you're using for your gauge swatch, your edge stitches are going to be a little bit wonky and they're not going to be an accurate measurement of gauge. So you need to add some more stitches on the sides to cover that little bit of wonkiness. So let's do a little bit of math to figure out how many stitches to cast on. Okay, so let's go through the math. We start off with 20 stitches over 4 inches. So the first thing we need to do is figure out how many stitches are in 1 inch. So we take the 20 stitches, divide it by 4, and we get 5. So therefore we know 5 stitches equals 1 inch. Since we want to measure 1 inch, or we want to measure 4 inches of our gauge swatch, then we need to probably add about 1 inch on either side. So I didn't put this on the board, but 4 plus 2 equals 6. So we want 6 inches total. So that means we're adding 2 extra inches. So 5 stitches per inch, 5 times 2 inches equals 10 extra stitches. So we have our original 20 stitches over 4 inches, our extra 10 stitches, which are going to give us an extra 2 inches, and that gives us 30 stitches total that we want to cast on. And if we're actually on gauge, our gauge swatch will be about 6 inches wide. So we'll go ahead and use these numbers for our example. You'll want to use whatever your gauge for your pattern says. If you have fractions, especially if you end up with a fraction, go ahead and round up to the next whole stitch. So I've already cast on and knit most of one row. So I'm going to go ahead and finish out knitting this row. And when I come to the end, I do not want to turn my work as you would normally do to go back the other way. Instead, what I want to do is to take these stitches and slide them down to the other end of my needles. So you will need to use a circular needle for this method. So I take those stitches and I slide them down. But you'll notice that I have my working yarn all the way over here on this side, and I need it to be over on this side in order to work the stitches. So what do? This is where we use what is usually an I-cord method kind of applied to this knitting the swatch in the round. So you're going to leave a big loop of this yarn and just let it kind of flop behind you, and then go ahead and work the next row. So tension your yarn as you usually do, and the first stitch is usually a little difficult because you've got all this extra yarn back here. So I usually kind of give it a little extra tension here to make sure that it stays on my stitch, my needle, and becomes a stitch. So there you go. There, I'm going to knit a few stitches to make this a bit more stable. And you'll see that I have this big loop right back here. And that's what we're going to continue doing. Knit across the row, move all these stitches back to the first needle, leave a big loop, knit another row. So I'm going to go ahead and work the end of this row, and then I'll come back and show you another loop. Once again, I've knit to the end of this row, and instead of turning and going back the other way, I want to move all my stitches down to the other side of my circular needle. So push those back there, and then just like before, there's the loop from the first time that we did this. We're going to leave that loop. So leave a loop, tension your yarn, make sure to kind of hold that so you don't pull that loop too tight. Knit the first stitch on this next row. And again, I'll knit a couple of stitches for stability. There we go. And now I have 2 loops back here. And you're going to continue using this method and you'll end up with a lot of loops back here, but that's okay. Just let them hang to the back. Don't worry about them. We'll focus on them later when we're done with our swatch. And you want to knit your swatch however many rows it takes to get you probably between 5 and 6 inches for your height, because again the gauge is measured over 4 inches and you want a little extra on either side to make sure that any wonkiness on the ends are accounted for. So I'm going to go ahead and continue knitting this swatch, going back and instead of back and forth knitting, going ahead and pushing my stitches all the way to the other side, looping around, piling up all these loops until I have 5 or 6 inches on my needles, and then I'll come back and show you what to do. So at this point, let's pretend that I have at least 5, maybe 6 inches that I have knit for my gauge swatch. This is a point where you should do as I say and not as I do. I only have like 2 inches here, but for purposes of demonstration, I'm going to go ahead and pretend that it is the full length. Make sure you knit the full length. So it's time to go ahead and bind off. For the bind off, you can go ahead and turn the work and bind off. Wanted to show you the back side of the work. You'll notice all of those strands that we have been using to pull across the back to get our yarn back over to this side. And you'll also notice the edge stitches, as I mentioned, they're going to be wonky. So that's one reason why we cast on extra stitches to make up for the wonkiness of these stitches. So I am going to go ahead and bind off. So now I have my swatch and it is ready to wash. So go ahead and wash the swatch, soak it in some water with a little bit of wool wash for about 30 minutes. Then when you're done with that, just blot it with a towel dry so it's not soaking wet but just still damp. So go ahead and again do as I say and not as I do. Pretend this is a damp swatch. You'll notice again there are the strands that we've been pulling across in the back. You have 2 options here. As long as you've been good about making sure that your strands are loose, you might be able to do as I've done and fold over these sides. And if you take your ruler and make sure you have at least 4 inches, again, if this to here measures exactly 4 inches, then you might not have an accurate measurement. But if you can measure, say, here to here, which on this example swatch is actually not 4 inches, but if this were 4 inches, then you could actually leave your swatch like this and measure your gauge from here. However, if you have pulled some of these strands a little too tightly and you're not able to actually get this swatch to lie flat, so let's say that, for example, say these strands were really tight, and suddenly my swatch is now, there we go, I'm not able to pull this side over, and so my swatch looks like this. That is not going to get me a really good measurement. So you have 2 options. You can either reknit your swatch and make sure this time that you leave the strands really loose, or you can take a pair of scissors and cut your swatch. So you take your scissors and you just grab the strands, make sure that you're not grabbing any of the knitting, and cut. And once you've done that, you'll be able to put your swatch out and lay it flat, and then you can do much more accurate measurements. And I actually recommend that you do this for the most accurate measurements possible. But one warning, once you've done that, notice now you have all these ends, and if you try to unravel this swatch and reuse the yarn, you're going to end up with a bunch of small pieces of yarn. So at this point, this swatch is now unusable as far as reusing the yarn. But it's an excellent swatch that has been knit in the round. So it's up to you to decide whether or not you want to chance possibly being off on your gauge by leaving those strands uncut, so that way if you need the yarn, you can come back and unravel this swatch, or if you want the most accurate gauge possible and cut those strands so you can lay your flat swatch out to measure. So I hope that helps you, and I hope that next time you have a project knit in the round, you'll also do your gauge swatch in the round. Thanks, and happy knitting!